The first time that my father died was about 30 years ago. Dad went for a regular physical, and the doctor saw something in a test that he didn't like at all. So much so that the doctor walked my dad across the parking lot from his office over to the hospital, where coincidentally my mother worked as a registered nurse. The doctor put him through a bunch of tests, hooked him up to some machines, and when the doctor came back to talk to my dad, he told my dad, "You have a brain aneurysm, and I need to operate on you right now." Mom called my brother and me, and my mom is the calmest human being I've ever met. She is the eye in every storm. But I could tell by the tone of her voice that she was really worried. They operated on Dad for about 6 hours, and they wouldn't let us see him for about 24 hours after that. When they finally did, I was up in the waiting area around the corner from his room, and my mom and my brother were downstairs in the cafeteria. So I was the first one to make it to his room. And when I got there, his bed was empty, freshly made. The machines were off, and I couldn't breathe. And I was standing there when a nurse walked into the room, and it was all I could do to point at the bed and say, "Tommy Street." She just pointed down the hall. So I went racing down the hall, and I looked in every room and every door. Nothing. I'm so mad at myself going down this hall looking for him, because the last thing I had said to him the day before was arguing with him on the back porch as he was smoking one cigarette and lighting it off of another. I said, "All the stuff you got going on, don't you know that stuff will kill you?" And he just laughed. I made it to the end of the hallway, and there was just one door, and I pushed through it, and it was out onto a patio on the 5th floor of the hospital, overlooking the parking lot. And there stood my dad, arm on the rail, casually looking out over the landscape in his hospital gown and his head wrapped up like a giant Q-tip, pulling his tray with him that had his bag on it, smoking a cigarette, and then clearly enjoying the hell out of it. And I was so mad at myself, but I saw him and I knew I hadn't lost him, and I was just overcome with joy and love for my dad and totally forgot about him. "10 months ago, my dad died for the second time. This time for real. He'd been in a lot of pain and in and out of the hospital for a couple of years, and it had been pretty excruciating for him and for my mom, who was his caretaker. And the last weekend, I had a chance to visit with him all day Saturday, all day Sunday, sitting by his side in the hospital room. And we talked and talked and talked, and it was wonderful. And on Sunday afternoon, when it was time for me to leave him in the hospital in Augusta and come back home to Florida, I kissed him on top of his bald head, and he kissed me back on my cheek, and he said what he always says, which is, "I love you, and I'm proud to be your dad." And I told him, "I love you, and I'm proud to be your son." And that was the last thing we ever had a chance to say to each other, except for one last thing. Jokingly, on the way out of the room, I said, "Hey, old man, can I get you a cigarette?" He just grinned a silly, toothless grin and looked at me and said, "Boy, don't you know those things will kill you?" I miss my dad.